The hum of the outdated fluorescent lights is a sound I've come to associate with her absence, a hollow thrum that echoes the emptiness in my chest. Havenwood, Illinois. It had sounded like a promise on the faded map I'd unfolded in a greasy spoon diner a state away, a name suggesting peace, a place to let the raw edges of grief soften. I'd pictured tree-lined streets, quiet neighbors, the kind of anonymity that might allow the constant, low-grade ache of Sarah's loss to finally recede into the background hum of a new life. Instead, I found Serenity Scripts Pharmacy, a relic of a building wedged between a defunct laundromat and a pawn shop, its sign a sickly yellow against the perpetual twilight of this forgotten corner of town. It wasn't the sanctuary I'd envisioned, but it offered a graveyard shift, a blessed vacancy of human interaction, and that, in itself, was a balm. Miss Eleanor Albright, the pharmacy's manager, had eyes like chips of winter ice, and a posture so rigid it seemed carved from the dark wood of the pharmacy's ancient countertops. Her interview questions were less about my qualifications, which were, admittedly, thin, and more about my tolerance for solitude and my ability to maintain absolute, unwavering silence. "The night shift here, Mr. Maxwell," she'd said, her voice a dry rustle, "has its own particular rhythm. It demands a certain discretion." I'd nodded, desperate, the image of Sarah's vacant hospital bed still searing itself onto the inside of my eyelids every time I closed them. Discretion, silence, solitude. They were old companions by then. I'd have agreed to almost anything to escape the crushing weight of my own thoughts, to trade them for the mundane task of stocking shelves and ringing up the occasional late-night insomniac. The pharmacy itself was a labyrinth of shadows, and the cloying scent of disinfectant mixed with something older, something indefinably sad, like dust motes carrying forgotten sorrows. Towering shelves, crammed with amber bottles and stark white boxes, loomed like silent sentinels in the dim light. The air was always cool, unnaturally still, as if the building itself held its breath. Even during the day, when the sun fought its way through the grimy front windows, there was a hushed quality to Serenity Scripts, a sense that voices should be kept low, movements measured. It was a place that seemed to absorb sound, to muffle the outside world, creating its own pocket of insulated quiet. I wondered sometimes if the quiet was what drew people like Miss Albright to it, or if the quiet was something the pharmacy demanded. My first few nights were a blur of restocking antiseptics and counting pills, the silence broken only by the rhythmic tick of a grandfather clock in Miss Albright's cramped back office, a sound that seemed to measure out not just time, but something else, something less tangible. I'd find myself staring at the rows of medications, their names a litany of human frailty: analgesics for pain, sedatives for unrest, antidepressants for a despair I knew too well. Each bottle seemed a tiny vessel of hope, or perhaps just a temporary reprieve. I tried not to think of Sarah, of the endless parade of medications that had failed to keep her here, of the sterile scent of the hospital room that had become her last world. But the pharmacy, with its inherent promise of healing, was a constant, cruel reminder. The town of Havenwood itself seemed to operate on a similar frequency of muted existence. Its residents moved with a kind of weary resignation, their faces etched with the quiet struggles of small-town life. I rarely interacted with them beyond the brief transactional encounters at the pharmacy counter during the day. At night, however, the streets outside Serenity Scripts were utterly deserted, swallowed by a darkness that felt deeper, more profound than any city night I'd known. It was as if Havenwood, too, adhered to some unspoken protocol of nocturnal stillness, a collective agreement to let the shadows reign. The silence, then, wasn't just within the pharmacy walls. It seeped out, blanketing the entire town in a shroud of quietude. I often caught myself tracing the grain of the old wooden counter, its surface worn smooth by decades of transactions, of whispered ailments and discreetly passed prescriptions. There was a history in that wood, a weight of countless untold stories. Sometimes a faint, almost imperceptible scent of lavender or chamomile would drift from a forgotten corner, a ghost of some old remedy. It was a place out of time, a feeling amplified by the flickering neon prescriptions sign outside, which cast an unsettling, pulsing glow into the interior, making the shadows dance and writhe in the periphery of my vision. I told myself it was just an old building, a new job, a temporary stop on a journey I hadn't yet figured out. But even in those early days, a thread of unease wove itself through the fabric of my forced normalcy. It was in the way Miss Albright's eyes would sometimes fix on a point just beyond my shoulder, a flicker of something unreadable in their icy depths. It was in the way the air would occasionally grow heavy, charged with an unseen presence, only to dissipate just as quickly. It was in the subtle, almost subliminal feeling of being watched, even when I knew I was utterly alone in the cavernous space of the pharmacy after the last customer had departed and the heavy front door had been triple locked. I dismissed it as grief playing tricks on my mind, the exhaustion of navigating a new life while carrying an old sorrow. I remember one particular evening, a week or so into the job. I was in the back, organizing newly arrived stock, the silence pressing in around me. Suddenly, a single small porcelain doll, the kind they kept in a dusty display case near the children's vitamins, toppled from its shelf in the main aisle, though there was no draft, no tremor, nothing to explain its fall. It landed face down, its painted smile obscured. I'd picked it up, its cold ceramic surprisingly heavy in my hand, a shiver tracing its way down my spine that had nothing to do with the pharmacy's constant chill. It was a small thing, easily dismissed, yet it lingered in my mind, a tiny crack in the veneer of the ordinary. The real turning point, however, the moment the quiet of Serenity Scripts began to feel less like a refuge and more like a carefully maintained prison, was the evening Miss Albright, just before locking up and leaving me to the solitude of the night, pressed a cool, laminated card into my hand. Her fingers, I noted, were surprisingly strong, her grip unyielding. "The protocols for the quiet shift, Mr. Maxwell," she'd stated, her voice devoid of inflection. "Memorize them, adhere to them, without deviation." And as I read those strange, unsettling rules under the flickering fluorescent glare, I felt a cold dread begin to seep into the marrow of my bones. Was this what lay beneath the surface of Havenwood's placid silence? The laminated card felt alien in my hand, its edges sharp against my palm, the typed words stark and unnervingly precise. My eyes scanned the first rule. 1. No sound above a whisper audible at 1 meter. This includes footsteps, the rustle of clothing, and the handling of all items. A prickle of unease ran down my neck. It was one thing to be asked to be quiet. It was another to have silence mandated with such chilling specificity. I glanced up at Miss Albright. Her face was a mask of impassivity, her gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the dusty bottles of cough syrup. She offered no further explanation, no hint of reassurance, merely a curt nod before turning and disappearing into the gloom of her back office. The click of her heels on the linoleum floor unnaturally loud in the sudden heavy silence. I continued reading, each rule tightening the knot of anxiety in my stomach. 2. The nocturnal prescriptions are not written. They will be felt at the silent dispensing counter. Trust your primary intuition. Do not question the impulse. Felt? Intuition? This was a pharmacy, not some New Age crystal shop. What kind of prescriptions were dispensed based on a... Rule 3 sent a genuine shiver through me. 3. Certain patients will require you to avoid direct eye contact. Their requests will be indicated by items left on specific, marked trays. Do not engage verbally unless absolutely necessary, and then only in response to a direct, non-verbal cue. Patients? Plural? I was supposed to be alone. The only patients I expected were the occasional stragglers picking up late-night pain relievers. Who were these nocturnal visitors who demanded such specific, almost fearful deference? The image of shadowy figures materializing in the dimly lit aisles, their faces unseen, their needs unspoken, began to form in my mind, unwelcome and vivid. The silence of the pharmacy, once a comfort, now felt charged, expectant. The list went on, each directive more bizarre than the last. 4. Aisle 7 personal hygiene products must remain entirely undisturbed between the hours of 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., regardless of any perceived stock depletion or customer request. Why aisle 7? What was so special about soap and deodorant that it warranted its own 2-hour period of sanctified stillness? I found myself glancing nervously towards that particular section of the store, its rows of brightly packaged products now appearing strangely sinister under the dim, flickering lights. A cold draft, seemingly from nowhere, snaked around my ankles, making the hairs on my arms stand on end. 5. If a glass vial or bottle shatters, leave the fragments undisturbed on the floor for precisely 9 minutes before cleaning. Use only the designated dustpan and brush, never a broom. 9 minutes, not 8, not 10, precisely 9. The specificity was unnerving, hinting at a logic that was utterly alien to me, a set of unseen consequences for even the slightest deviation. I pictured myself standing over a pile of glittering shards, the silence of the pharmacy amplifying the frantic ticking of my own heart as I counted down those agonizing minutes. What would happen if I were a second too early, or a moment too late? The card offered no clues, only the stark, unyielding command. Then there was the rule about Somnicil Forte, a potent fictional sedative apparently. 6. Somnicil Forte must be maintained in ample stock within the locked narcotics cabinet, but it is never to be dispensed to any patient who specifically requests it by name. This was a direct contradiction to every principle of pharmacy I understood. If a patient needed a sedative and it was available, why would one refuse? Unless the patients weren't seeking relief in the way I understood it. Unless Somnicil Forte had another purpose or another effect on them. The thought sent a fresh wave of apprehension through me. The ordinary act of dispensing medication was being twisted into something fraught with unseen dangers. The 7th rule was perhaps the most chilling, conjuring images I desperately tried to suppress. 7. If the distinct sound of a child's cry is heard emanating from the vicinity of the toy aisle, immediately place 3 drops of pure valerian root extract into the diffuser located at the end of aisle 3. Do not investigate the source of the sound. Do not approach the toy aisle. A child's cry? In the dead of night? In a locked pharmacy? My blood ran cold. I thought of Sarah, her small, trusting hand in mine. The idea of a child in distress, unseen, unhelped, was a torment. And the remedy? Valerian root in a diffuser? It felt like a folk charm, a ward against something unseen, rather than a practical solution. The carefully constructed reality of my new, quiet life was beginning to crumble. The final line on the card was less a rule and more a stark, ominous warning. 8. Any deviation from these protocols may irreparably disturb the delicate balance. It was printed in a slightly smaller, italicized font, as if whispered. The delicate balance. What balance? The balance of what? The silence of Serenity Scripts. I folded the card, my fingers trembling slightly, and slipped it into my pocket. It felt like a lead weight. I looked around the pharmacy, at the familiar shelves, the orderly rows of products, the faint, sterile scent. Everything appeared the same, yet everything had changed. It was as if a veil had been lifted, revealing a hidden, unsettling layer to this seemingly ordinary place. The quiet was no longer benign. It was a presence, a character in itself, demanding observance. And as the grandfather clock in Miss Albright's office chimed the hour, marking the true beginning of my first quietude shift, a profound sense of isolation washed over me. I was alone, not just in the building, but alone with a secret, a set of rules that hinted at a reality I couldn't begin to comprehend. What had I stumbled into? The first hour after Miss Albright's departure passed in a silence so profound it felt like a physical pressure against my eardrums. I moved through the aisles with exaggerated care, my rubber-soled shoes making almost no sound on the polished linoleum, acutely aware of rule number 1. Every rustle of my uniform, every soft click of a pill bottle being replaced on a shelf seemed to echo in the stillness. I found myself holding my breath, listening. Listening for what? I wasn't sure. Perhaps for the first sign that the delicate balance was something more than just a phrase on a laminated card. The fluorescent lights hummed their monotonous song, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe with a life of their own in the periphery. My own grief felt amplified in the quiet, a dull ache in my chest that resonated with the pharmacy's strange, sorrowful atmosphere. Around 1 a.m., the bell above the front door, which I was certain Miss Albright had locked and bolted, emitted a single, soft chime, no louder than a sigh. My heart leaped into my throat. I froze, straining my ears, but there was no other sound, no footsteps, no creak of the door opening further. According to the schedule, no one should be here. I cautiously made my way to the front, peering through the narrow gap between the closed sign and the window frame. The street outside was deserted, bathed in the sickly orange glow of a distant streetlight. Nothing. I told myself it was the wind, an old building settling, anything but what the rules implied, the arrival of a patient. Yet a cold spot had formed near the entrance, a palpable drop in temperature that had no rational explanation. Returning to the main counter, I felt it. A subtle pressure against my chest, a faint, almost inaudible whisper in the very edge of my hearing, like static on a radio tuned to a dead channel. It wasn't a voice, not exactly, but an impression, a surge of longing. No, it was more specific than that. A yearning for calmness. My eyes were drawn to the silent dispensing counter, a small, unadorned section of formica to my left, as stipulated by rule number 2. As I approached it, the sensation intensified, guiding my hand, almost against my will, towards a shelf of unlabeled cobalt blue vials tucked away in a shadowed alcove. My fingers closed around one, cool and smooth. The impulse was undeniable, a certainty that this was what was required. This was the nocturnal prescription. Just then, a figure materialized near the vitamins aisle. I hadn't heard her approach, hadn't seen her enter. One moment, the aisle was empty. The next, she was there. A woman, or the translucent echo of one, her form shimmering slightly, like heat above asphalt. She was draped in what looked like a faded, lace-trimmed dressing gown, and her bare feet seemed to hover an inch above the floor. A chill emanated from her, so profound it made my teeth ache. She didn't speak, didn't even look directly at me, but her presence radiated an overwhelming sense of weariness, a sorrow so deep it felt ancient. She drifted towards the counter, her movements fluid, yet somehow too deliberate, too unhurried. This had to be one of the patients rule number 3 had warned about. I remembered the rule: no direct eye contact. I kept my gaze fixed on the counter, my hand tightening around the cobalt vial. The air around her crackled with a faint, unseen energy, and the scent of withered lilies, faint but distinct, filled my nostrils. She extended a pale, almost luminous hand, palm up, towards the marked tray on the counter. There was no verbal request, no written slip, just that silent, expectant gesture. My own hand moved, seemingly of its own accord, placing the blue vial onto the tray. Her fingers, long and slender, closed around it, and for a fleeting second, our fingertips brushed. Her skin was like ice, a dry, shocking cold that jolted through me. She gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod, then turned and drifted back the way she had come, vanishing into the shadows near aisle 7 as silently as she had appeared. The encounter left me shaken, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The vial was gone. The cold spot lingered. I leaned against the counter, trying to steady my racing pulse. This wasn't just an old pharmacy with quirky rules. This was something else, something that operated on principles beyond my comprehension. The prescription I'd felt, had it helped her? Or had I merely participated in some strange nocturnal ritual? From the back, where the compounding lab was located, I heard a soft cough. Silas Blackwood, the senior night pharmacist I'd only glimpsed briefly during my orientation, emerged, wiping his hands on a pristine white apron. He was an older man, his face a roadmap of deep lines, his eyes weary but surprisingly sharp, holding a glint of something that might have been sympathy, or perhaps just long, tired experience. "First one's always a bit of a jolt, isn't it, son?" Silas said, his voice a low rumble, surprisingly gentle. He didn't seem surprised by what I'd just witnessed. He moved with a slow, deliberate economy of motion, his presence somehow grounding in the unsettling atmosphere. You get used to the nuances of the quietude shift. He gestured vaguely towards the empty space where the woman had been. They all have their needs, their persistent echoes. Our job isn't to cure, not in the way the daytime folks understand it. It's to soothe, to maintain the quiet. He picked up a stray bottle from the counter, his gaze distant. Heavenwood has long memories, Leo, and this place is where some of those memories come to rest. Or try to. Over the next few hours, more patients arrived, each more unsettling than the last. a stooped man, his face perpetually obscured by shadow, who left a single wilted marigold on his designated tray, and for whom I felt compelled to dispense a small unmarked tin of what smelled like beeswax and herbs. A pair of indistinct figures, almost like smudges of smoke, who moved in perfect, silent unison, and for whom I selected 2 identical gray lozenges. With each encounter, the feeling of being guided by an unseen force, the intuition mentioned in the rules, grew stronger, more undeniable. It was as if the pharmacy itself was whispering its needs to me, using me as its conduit. My own grief, my sorrow for Sarah, seemed to resonate with the collective desolation these patients exuded, creating a strange, almost painful empathy within me. The most disturbing event of that first full shift occurred around 3:30 a.m. A faint, almost inaudible whimpering, like a distressed kitten, began to emanate from the darkened toy aisle at the far end of the store. My blood turned to ice. Rule 7. If the distinct sound of a child's cry is heard, it wasn't a kitten. It was higher-pitched, more human, a desperate, heartbroken sound that clawed at my insides. Every instinct screamed at me to investigate, to find the source, to offer comfort. But the rule was explicit. Do not investigate. Immediately place 3 drops of pure valerian root extract into the diffuser. Silas, who had been silently observing me from his station, simply nodded towards aisle 3, his expression unreadable. My hands shook as I retrieved. The delicate balance, then, was the fragile equilibrium between the mundane world and this unseen realm of concentrated sorrow. And our role, mine and Silas's and Miss Albright's, was to act as psychic sanitation workers, custodians of collective grief. The nocturnal prescriptions, I ventured, my voice hoarse, the things I felt I had to dispense, what are they? Silas shrugged, a small, tired gesture. Placebos, mostly. Energetic placebos, if you want to get technical. Conduits. Sometimes it's a specific scent, a texture, a color that resonates with a particular echo, offering a moment of neutrality, a brief respite from their looping sorrow. It's not a cure. There is no cure for what they are. It's about containment, about ensuring these echoes don't bleed out, overwhelm the living. He explained that the rules, as strange as they seemed, were all meticulously designed for this purpose, refined over generations of quietude shift workers. The silence, to avoid agitating the echoes. The aversion of eye contact, because direct acknowledgement could sometimes strengthen their manifestation, make them more insistent. The 9-minute rule for broken glass? Some echoes are drawn to sharp, sudden disruptions, Silas murmured. The delay allows their interest to wane, prevents them from coalescing around the fractured energy. Aisle 7, undisturbed between 2 and 4? That's when the ambient psychic pressure is at its peak. That aisle, for reasons no one quite understands, acts as a kind of natural vent. Disturbing it then could cause a blowback. It was a staggering amount to take in, a hidden world existing just beneath the surface of a sleepy Illinois town. My own personal grief, my mourning for Sarah, suddenly felt both incredibly small and terrifyingly connected to this larger, unseen ocean of sorrow that Serenity Scripts was tasked with managing. I thought of the intense, almost physical empathy I'd felt with some of the echoes, the way their desolation had resonated within my own wounded psyche. Was that why Miss Albright had hired me? Had she sensed my own attunement to loss, my vulnerability to the pharmacy's strange currents? Or was I just another desperate soul willing to work the graveyard shift, no questions asked, at least initially? So this delicate balance, I said, the words feeling heavy and foreign on my tongue. What happens if it's irreparably disturbed, like the card said? Silas finished his coffee, his expression becoming grim. Then Havenwood stops being quite so serene, Leo. Then the quiet breaks. And what rushes in to fill the void? Well, let's just say it's not something you want to witness. The echoes, uncontained, can overwhelm the living, amplify their own latent sorrows, their fears, their despairs. Mass hysteria, localized outbreaks of profound depression, even violence. This pharmacy, this quietude shift, it's a dam. A very old, very fragile dam, holding back a flood of concentrated human misery. He looked at me then, his gaze direct and searching. And now, you're one of the gatekeepers, son, whether you wanted to be or not. The weight of Silas's revelation settled upon me like the oppressive humidity of a summer storm about to break. Gatekeeper. The word echoed in the sterile confines of Serenity scripts, a title I neither sought nor felt equipped to bear. My own grief, a constant, aching companion since Sarah's passing, suddenly felt amplified, a tuning fork vibrating in sympathy with the collective sorrow this building contained. It was no longer just my pain, it was a shared resonance, a terrifying empathy that threatened to engulf me. Each shift became a tightrope walk, not just adhering to the bizarre protocols, but navigating the treacherous landscape of my own emotions, which seemed to ebb and flow with the pharmacy's unseen tides. I began to dread the setting of the sun, the deepening of the shadows, the hour when the quietude shift would commence. The echoes, now that I understood their nature, became less like anonymous apparitions and more like fractured reflections of human suffering. I'd see a flicker of Sarah's stubborn chin in the way one echo, a young woman who perpetually clutched a faded, water-stained book, refused to meet my gaze. I'd hear a distorted echo of my father's weary sigh in the guttural murmur of an old man who always sought something to quiet the buzzing. This newfound, unwelcome empathy was a dangerous thing. The rules mandated detachment, a clinical, almost ritualistic interaction. But how could I remain detached when the sorrow I was meant to soothe felt so intimately familiar, so deeply personal? The temptation to break protocol, to offer a word of genuine comfort, to reach out, became a constant, agonizing battle. One night, a new echo manifested. It was smaller than the others, almost childlike in its wavering form, and it exuded an aura of such profound loneliness that it physically pained me to be near it. It didn't approach the counter, didn't leave an item on a tray. It simply hovered near the children's vitamin display, its indistinct shape trembling. My heart constricted. Sarah. It wasn't her, I knew it wasn't, but the raw, unadulterated grief it projected was a direct echo of my own desperate longing for my sister. The rules were silent on such passive manifestations. I felt an overwhelming urge to go to it, to speak to it, to offer something, anything. Don't, Silas's voice, low and firm, cut through my turmoil from across the pharmacy. Rule 2, Leo. Trust your primary intuition at the silent dispensing counter, nowhere else. You engage that one directly, you might anchor it, or worse, it might anchor to you. The warning chilled me, but the internal conflict raged. Was this not what I was here for? To soothe? How could I soothe if I couldn't connect? My own loss felt like a gaping wound, and I found myself irrationally wondering if, by helping these echoes, I could somehow vicariously heal a part of myself. Or perhaps I was subconsciously seeking an echo of Sarah, a ghostly confirmation that some part of her, however fractured, still lingered. This thought, once it took root, became a dangerous obsession. I started paying closer attention to the faintest whispers, the coldest spots, searching for any sign that felt uniquely Sarah. Silas watched me with growing concern, his usual weary patience occasionally giving way to a sharper, more cautionary tone. "Grief is a magnet here, son," he'd said one morning, his eyes troubled. "Don't let yours become a beacon." Ms. Albright, too, seemed to notice the change in me. The way my movements had become less certain, my silences more fraught. Her already reserved demeanor grew even more guarded. I'd catch her observing me from the shadowed doorway of her office, her expression unreadable but undeniably tense. The few conversations we had were terse, focused solely on inventory and scheduling. Yet beneath the surface, I sensed a mounting anxiety in her, a tightening of the reins. She began to mention, with increasing frequency, an upcoming assessment by some unnamed oversight committee, a group responsible for ensuring the continued efficacy and integrity of repositories like ours. Her words were laced with an undercurrent of dread, and I started to suspect that her concern wasn't just for the delicate balance, but for her own position, for the very existence of Serenity Scripts as we knew it. The pharmacy itself seemed to reflect this growing internal and external pressure. The air felt heavier, the shadows deeper, more active. The echoes became more restless, their manifestations more frequent, their needs more urgent, more difficult to intuit. One night, a vial of what I felt should be dispensed to a particularly agitated echo, a tall, gaunt figure wringing its spectral hands, simply refused to leave my grasp when I tried to place it on the tray. It was as if an invisible force held it fast. The echo let out a silent, psychic scream that reverberated through my skull, and for a moment the lights in the pharmacy flickered violently. Silas had to intervene, performing a quick, almost violent. My attempts to find solace in my off hours became futile. Sleep was haunted by shadowy figures and the scent of valerian. The faces of the echoes blended with Sarah's in my dreams. I started avoiding people during the day, the forced cheerfulness of Havenwood's residents grating on my raw nerves. I felt increasingly isolated, caught between the world of the living, which no longer felt entirely real, and the spectral realm of Serenity Scripts, which was becoming all too vivid. My grief, instead of receding, was being constantly prodded, inflamed by the nightly immersion in concentrated despair. I began to question my own sanity. Was I truly helping, or was I simply becoming another lost soul trapped in the pharmacy's sorrowful orbit? The thought of the oversight committee loomed large. What would they assess? Our adherence to the rules? The stability of the echoes? Or perhaps the emotional state of the gatekeepers themselves? I imagined stern, faceless figures scrutinizing my every move, judging my internal struggles, my dangerous empathy. If they deemed me a risk, what would happen? Would I be removed? Replaced? The idea filled me with a strange mixture of fear and a perverse desire for release. Yet, the thought of abandoning Serenity Scripts, of leaving Silas, and even the inscrutable Miss Albright to face whatever was coming, also felt like a betrayal. I was trapped, not by circumstance, but by a growing, unwelcome sense of responsibility. One particularly bleak morning, after a night where the toy aisle's cries had been almost continuous, despite repeated applications of valerian, I found a small, antique silver locket on the floor near the silent dispensing counter. It wasn't there when my shift started. It was intricately carved with forget-me-nots. Inside, there was no picture, just a faint, lingering scent of lemon verbena, Sarah's favorite. My breath hitched. Was it a sign? A message? Or was my grief-stricken mind finally manufacturing connections where none existed? I pocketed it, a secret, heavy weight against my heart, a tangible symbol of the fracturing boundary between my sorrow and the pharmacies. The delicate balance wasn't just external anymore. It was the fragile state of my own soul. The weeks leading up to the assessment by the Oversight Committee were thick with an almost unbearable tension. Miss Albright became a wraith herself, gliding through the pharmacy with a brittle efficiency, her already pale complexion taking on a translucent quality. Silas grew more taciturn, his pronouncements fewer but freighted with a heavier weariness. Even the echoes seemed to sense the shift. Their manifestations became more erratic, their silent demands more urgent, sometimes contradictory. The very air in Serenity scripts felt thin, stretched taut, as if the delicate membrane between worlds was wearing dangerously through in places, threatening to rip. My own nerves were frayed, each unexpected sound, each flicker of the lights sending a jolt of adrenaline through my system. The locket, Sarah's supposed locket, remained a cold, constant pressure in my pocket, a reminder of my internal unraveling. The delicate balance wasn't just external anymore. It was the fragile state of my own soul. The weeks leading up to the assessment by the Oversight Committee were thick with an almost unbearable tension. Miss Albright became a wraith herself, gliding through the pharmacy with a brittle efficiency, her already pale complexion taking on a translucent quality. Silas grew more taciturn, his pronouncements fewer but freighted with a heavier weariness. Even the echoes seemed to sense the shift. Their manifestations became more erratic, their silent demands more urgent, sometimes contradictory. The very air in Serenity scripts felt thin, stretched taut, as if the delicate membrane between worlds was wearing dangerously through in places, threatening to rip. My own nerves were frayed, each unexpected sound, each flicker of the lights sending a jolt of adrenaline through my system. The locket, the scent of valerian, earthy and a little cloying, slowly permeated the air in aisle 3, and as it did, the faint, heartbreaking cries from the toy aisle began to subside, not abruptly, but fading like a distant echo, until only the oppressive silence of Serenity scripts remained. I stood there, heart pounding, the empty valerian dropper clutched in my trembling hand. The relief was immense, yet it was tainted with a profound sense of guilt and a gnawing unease. What had I just done? What had I just participated in? The rules, once merely bizarre, now felt like ironclad laws governing a reality I was only just beginning to perceive, a reality where a child's distress was met not with comfort, but with a prescribed aromatic appeasement. The image of Sarah, small and vulnerable in her hospital bed, flashed through my mind, and a fresh wave of sorrow, sharp and cold, washed over me. Later, as the first hint of dawn began to paint the grimy windows with a pale gray light, and the last of the nocturnal patients had faded back into whatever liminal space they inhabited, Silas found me slumped on a stool behind the main counter, staring blankly at the rows of mundane daytime medications. He poured 2 cups of what smelled like chicory coffee from an old battered thermos, the steam rising in the cool air. He didn't speak for a long time, just sat beside me, the silence between us companionable rather than strained. It was a different kind of quiet now, the delicate balance seemingly restored, but the pharmacy still hummed with a latent, unseen energy, a residual thrum of the night's strange transactions. "You're wondering what this place really is, aren't you, Leo?" Silas finally said, his voice low, almost a murmur. He took a slow sip of his coffee, his gaze fixed on the awakening street outside. "It's not in any of the employee handbooks, not the official ones anyway. Miss Albright, she prefers discretion. But you've seen enough tonight to know Serenity Scripts isn't just about filling prescriptions for coughs and colds, not after the sun goes down." He sighed, a sound as wary as the ancient building itself. "This pharmacy, son, it's older than it looks, and it serves a different kind of ailment during the quietude shift. It's a repository, a filter, if you like." He paused, choosing his words carefully, as if testing their weight before releasing them into the fragile morning air. "Heavenwood, this whole area, it sits on land that has a peculiar kind of memory, a geological sentience, some might call it. It holds on to things, strong emotions, traumas, profound losses, the kind of grief that doesn't just fade with time, but seeps into the very soil, into the stones." He gestured vaguely around the pharmacy. "And this building, Serenity Scripts, was either very wisely or very foolishly built right on top of a confluence point, a place where those emotional residues tend to gather, to concentrate, like sediment in a still pond." My mind reeled. Geological sentience? Emotional residues? This was far beyond any grief counseling pamphlet I'd ever skimmed. "The patients you saw tonight," Silas continued, his voice dropping even lower, "they aren't ghosts, not in the traditional sense. They're echoes, manifestations of those accumulated psychic energies. The woman who wanted calmness, likely the lingering despair of someone who lost a long, drawn-out battle with an illness, right here in this town, decades ago. The man in shadows seeking lost colors, perhaps the echo of an artist who lost his sight, his passion extinguished. The crying child?" He hesitated, a flicker of something akin to pain in his old eyes. "That one's always the hardest. Usually a sudden, tragic loss, a life unlived. The valerian, it doesn't silence the cry, not really. It harmonizes it, just enough so it doesn't shatter the balance." This was no mere echo. This was something primal, something ancient. "The lamento inconsolable," Silas breathed from somewhere behind me in the darkness, his voice raspy with a terror I had never heard in him before. It's breaching." A wave of unimaginable sorrow washed over me, so potent it brought me to my knees. It wasn't just sadness, it was the concentrated agony of every loss, every betrayal, every moment of unbearable pain ever experienced within Havenwood's melancholic borders, all focused into a single sentient point of misery. My own grief for Sarah, which I thought had reached its zenith, was a pale candle flame next to this inferno of despair. I felt myself drowning in it, my identity, my memories, my very will to live dissolving into its black tide. From the direction of the locked narcotics cabinet, a shadowy form began to coalesce. It was vast, shapeless, yet somehow hideously defined by the sheer intensity of its darkness. It had no features, no discernible limbs, yet I felt an intelligence within it, a cold, calculating awareness. It pulsed, a heart of pure desolation, and with each throb, the glass bottles on the shelves rattled violently, some of them cracking, their contents spilling onto the floor. The mingled scents of chemicals and botanicals, a bizarre, sickening perfume in the suffocating air. The emergency lights flickered, casting the Lamento in strobing, nightmarish relief. It seemed to be drawing energy from the pharmacy itself, from the accumulated echoes, from the very fear that now paralyzed me. The rules, the meticulous protocols felt like children's toys against this abyss. What good was valerian root against a grief that could swallow worlds? What meaning did 9 minutes have when faced with an eternity of sorrow? I fumbled in my pocket for the laminated card, a desperate, futile gesture. My fingers brushed against the cool metal of the locket, and a jolt like an electric shock coursed through me. For a moment, a fleeting, incandescent image of Sarah's smile, bright and fearless, pierced through the overwhelming darkness in my mind. It wasn't enough to banish the Lamento, but it was enough to give me a sliver of myself back, enough to fight the paralysis. "Silas, Miss Albright," I managed to croak, my voice barely a whisper. From the back office, I heard a sharp intake of breath. Then Miss Albright's voice, surprisingly steady despite the tremor I could detect. "The Somnisul Forte. It's going for the Somnisul Forte." Rule 6, never to be dispensed to any patient who specifically requests it by name. But the Lamento wasn't requesting, it was taking. The heavy steel door of the narcotics cabinet, which required 2 keys and a combination, began to buckle inwards, groaning under an immense, unseen pressure, as if giant hands were crushing it. The Lamento, I realized with dawning horror, wasn't just an accumulation of sorrow, it was hungry. It sought to amplify itself, to absorb the potent numbness of the sedative, perhaps to spread its despair beyond the confines of Serenity scripts. Just as the cabinet door was about to give way entirely, Miss Albright appeared, a stark silhouette against the faint red glow. In her hands, she held not a valerian diffuser, but a heavy, antique-looking ledger bound in cracked leather, and a small, tarnished silver bell. Silas was beside her, holding aloft a fistful of what looked like dried herbs, which he ignited with a flick of a lighter. The herbs smoldered, releasing a sharp, acrid smoke that stung my eyes, but seemed to momentarily push back the oppressive weight of the Lamento. "The old wards, Mr. Maxwell," Miss Albright cried, her voice cutting through the psychic din. "The foundations, we must reinforce them." She began to chant in a low, rhythmic cadence, words in a language I didn't recognize, but which resonated deep within my bones, while striking the silver bell with a precise, almost violent rhythm. The Lamento recoiled. A silent, furious shriek of frustration tearing through the psychic atmosphere. It was a battle of wills, of ancient sorrow against an even older, perhaps forgotten, form of containment. The pharmacy became a battleground. The mundane shelves of aspirin and antacids the silent witnesses to a conflict that transcended human understanding. The illusion of safety, the carefully constructed quietude of Serenity scripts had not just been broken, it had been shattered, and in its place was a raw, terrifying glimpse of the abyss this fragile pharmacy had been holding at bay for who knew how long. My own small griefs, my personal struggles seemed utterly insignificant in the face of this existential dread. The air crackled, the temperature plummeted further, and I could feel the lamento gathering itself for another assault, its dark energy coiling like a monstrous serpent. The reinforced wards, the chanting, the smoking herbs, they were a temporary measure, a desperate holding action. We were outmatched. The delicate balance was not just disturbed, it was on the verge of annihilation. And as the first true, audible wail of despair tore from the lamento, a sound that promised madness and ruin, I knew that whatever happened next, Serenity Scripts and perhaps Havenwood itself would never be the same. The rules had failed. Our perceived security was a lie. We were truly alone, facing something that had no name in any pharmacopoeia. The piercing wail of the lamento inconsolable ripped through the pharmacy, a sound that wasn't merely auditory, but vibrated deep within my bones, shaking the very foundations of my sanity. The emergency lights, already dim, sputtered and died, plunging us into an almost absolute blackness, broken only by the faint, eerie glow of the smoldering herbs in Silas's hand, and the glint of Miss Albright's silver bell as it continued its desperate, rhythmic tolling. The ancient words she chanted grew more forceful, more strained, a fragile bulwark against the encroaching despair. But I could feel it, the lamento pressing in, its immense sorrow a tangible force, cold and suffocating, threatening to extinguish their frail defenses like a gust of wind snuffing out a candle. The old system, the carefully maintained protocols of the quietude shift, had utterly collapsed. In the oppressive darkness, I heard a sickening crunch of metal, the narcotics cabinet. The lamento had breached it. A wave of triumphant, chilling despair washed over us, and I felt Silas stumble beside me, his breath catching in a pained gasp. It's too strong," he choked out, the herbs falling from his suddenly nerveless fingers, their protective smoke dissipating into the hungry void. Miss Albright's chanting faltered, the silver bell's chime becoming erratic, then ceasing altogether. A profound, terrifying silence descended, a silence pregnant with imminent ruin, far more dreadful than the carefully curated quiet we had strived to maintain. The lamento was no longer just a presence, it was a power, unchained and ravenous. "The committee," Miss Albright whispered, her voice a thin, broken thread in the darkness. "They were meant to recalibrate, to reinforce. They're too late." Her words confirmed my deepest fears. The assessment wasn't a mere review. It was a desperately needed intervention, an acknowledgement that Serenity Scripts was failing, that its ancient mechanisms of containment were crumbling under the weight of accumulated sorrow. And now, with the lamento unleashed, any hope of a controlled recalibration was gone. We were facing not just a disturbance of the delicate balance, but its complete and utter annihilation. Havenwood, oblivious in its slumber, was on the precipice of a psychic cataclysm. A new sound began to fill the void, a chorus of whispers, faint at first, then growing in volume. A cacophony of disembodied voices murmuring tales of loss, of regret, of unending pain. The echoes, the lesser manifestations of sorrow we had so carefully managed, were being drawn into the lamento's vortex, their individual despairs merging with its overwhelming power, amplifying it. I could feel their presence, a multitude of cold spots, my own grief for Sarah, which had momentarily offered a spark of resistance, now threatened to betray me. The lamento seemed to sense it, to probe at it, its tendrils of despair wrapping around my heart, whispering insidious comforts, promising an end to pain through utter surrender to its desolate embrace. Join us, it seemed to hum, a siren song of shared oblivion. Let go. There is peace in the endless sorrow. For a terrifying moment, I felt my will begin to crumble. What was the point of fighting? What was the point of anything when faced with such an ocean of unending pain? Sarah was gone. Perhaps this was where all lost things eventually gathered. "Leo!" Silas's voice, sharp with a sudden desperate urgency, cut through my despair-induced stupor. He'd managed to find a heavy-duty flashlight, its beam cutting a shaky swath through the oppressive gloom. It illuminated Ms. Albright, slumped against a counter, her face ashen, the ancient ledger fallen at her feet. But Silas wasn't looking at her. He was looking at me, his eyes wide with a dawning, horrified realization. "Your locket, boy, the one you found, it's glowing." I fumbled in my pocket, my fingers clumsy with cold and fear. The silver locket, Sarah's locket, was indeed emitting a faint, pulsating silvery light, a tiny beacon in the overwhelming darkness, warm against my palm. Ms. Albright stirred, pushing herself upright with a visible effort. Her gaze, too, was fixed on the locket. The records," she rasped, pointing a trembling finger towards her office. "Dr. Hayes, Evelyn Hayes, she wrote of focal points, of sympathetic anchors, objects that could channel or deflect." Her voice trailed off, her strength failing. But the implication was clear. This locket, which I had assumed was a cruel trick of my grieving mind, might be something more, something connected not just to my personal loss, but to the very fabric of this place, to a forgotten history, a potential, however slim, of resistance. The old system had collapsed, but perhaps within its ruins lay the seeds of a new, desperate strategy. Silas grabbed my arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "There's no time for the committee, no time for reinforcements. It's us, Leo. Us and whatever knowledge is buried in this cursed place." His fear was still palpable, but it was now overlaid with a grim determination. The lamento is trying to fully manifest, to create a permanent wound here. If it succeeds, Havenwood is lost. The weight of his words was crushing, yet, strangely, the faint, warm glow of the locket in my hand offered a tiny, irrational spark of hope. The rules were gone, the pharmacy's defenses breached, our protectors incapacitated. We were exposed, vulnerable, facing an entity of unimaginable sorrow. The old ways had failed. It was time to find something new, or be consumed. The reconfiguration was brutal, immediate. We were no longer employees following a set of arcane protocols. We were survivors, scrambling in the dark, armed with nothing but a glimmering locket, the fragmented memories of a dead pharmacist, and the dawning, terrifying realization that the fate of an entire town might now rest on our trembling shoulders. The lamento pulsed again, its power growing, the whispers intensifying, the cold deepening. We had to act, and act now, before the last vestiges of Serenity scripts and our own sanity were swallowed by the inconsolable dark. The collapse was total. Now, from the wreckage, we had to find a weapon. The beam of Silas's flashlight cut a frantic path through the Stygian gloom of Miss Albright's office, a cramped, chaotic space that smelled of dust, old paper, and a faint, lingering trace of lavender. The grandfather clock in the corner stood silent, its hands frozen at the exact moment the lamento had fully breached, a chilling testament to the power we faced. Ms. Albright, leaning heavily on Silas for support, directed us towards a row of battered metal filing cabinets. We pulled open the drawers, revealing a jumble of handwritten notes, faded photographs of Havenwood from a bygone era, pressed flowers brittle with age, and, tucked away at the very back of the lowest drawer, a series of slender, leather-bound journals. Their covers were worn smooth, the gold lettering of the titles almost entirely effaced. But as I ran my fingers over one, the locket in my pocket pulsed with a distinct, almost eager warmth. "These," I said, my voice barely a whisper, pulling one out. "These must be them. Dr. Evelyn Hayes's Quietude Logs." The name felt significant, a key unearthed from the depths of the pharmacy's forgotten history. With trembling hands, I opened the first journal, its pages thin and crackling, covered in a spidery, elegant script. Dr. Hayes's observations spanned decades, a meticulous, almost obsessive catalog of Serenity Script's nocturnal phenomena. She described echoes I recognized from my own brief tenure, but with a depth of understanding that far surpassed Silas's weary pragmatism. She wrote of their emotional signatures, their resonant frequencies, their points of origin within the town's sorrowful past. But it was her later entries, penned in a shakier, more urgent hand, that seized our attention. She too had witnessed the precursor stirrings of something like the lamento, a great sorrow, as she called it, that threatened to overwhelm the pharmacy's delicate mechanisms. She theorized, Miss Albright breathed, peering over my shoulder, her face illuminated by the locket's faint silvery glow, which seemed to intensify as I read, that a sufficiently powerful, concentrated echo, like the lamento, wasn't just an accumulation of ambient despair. It was anchored to a primary unresolved trauma, a core wound. Dr. Hayes believed that if this core wound could be identified, and if a sympathetic resonance could be established, the great sorrow might not be banished, but transmuted, harmonized. She wrote of a procedure of psychic harmonization, a dangerous, untested ritual that required not just wards and herbs, but a willing, empathic catalyst, someone capable of meeting the great sorrow on its own terms, of absorbing and redirecting its overwhelming emotional charge. My gaze fell upon a particular passage, and the locket in my pocket burned with an almost painful heat. Dr. Hayes described a local tragedy from the late 19th century, a devastating fire at the old Havenwood orphanage, which had stood on the very land Serenity Scripts now occupied. Dozens of children had perished, their small lives extinguished in terror and pain. She speculated that the lamento inconsolabile was, at its heart, the collective, unassuaged grief of those lost children, magnified and distorted over a century of accumulation, a monstrous chorus of their final, terrified cries. The child's cry I'd heard from the toy aisle, the one soothed by valerian, it was a faint echo of this, a constant, sorrowful reminder. "The locket," I whispered, pulling it out, its silvery light now casting dancing shadows on the journal's pages. It was intricately carved with forget-me-nots, a common symbol of remembrance, particularly for children in that era. This must have belonged to one of them, one of the children from the orphanage. It wasn't Sarah's locket at all, not directly, but, perhaps, in some strange, inexplicable way, my own profound grief for my sister, a child lost too soon, had made me a sympathetic anchor for this older, even more terrible sorrow. My loss had, in a perverse way, attuned me to the lamento's core frequency, making me a potential catalyst for Dr. Hayes's desperate, forgotten procedure. The quietude logs detailed the ritual. It required specific botanical components, some of which, Silas realized with a jolt, were obscure herbs he'd seen listed in the pharmacy's oldest inventory ledgers, dismissed as archaic and useless, but which Miss Albright now recalled seeing tucked away in dusty, mislabeled jars in the deepest recesses of the storeroom. It also required a focal point of resonance, an object directly connected to the primary trauma, the locket. And finally, it required the empathic catalyst to willingly open themselves to the lamento's full force, not to fight it, but to feel it, to find the single original note of pain within its deafening chorus of despair, and to offer not a cure, but a shared understanding, an acknowledgement, a path towards a different kind of quiet. It was an insane gamble, a leap of faith into an abyss of unimaginable pain. But what other choice did we have? The lamento was growing stronger with each passing moment, its oppressive presence pressing down on us, the whispers from the other echoes becoming a menacing, predatory chorus. Miss Albright, her earlier fear replaced by a grim resolve, nodded slowly. "Evelyn Hayes was a brilliant woman," she said, her voice regaining some of its former strength. "Often dismissed, but perhaps she saw the true way." Silas, too, seemed to find a new resolve in this face of this desperate 11th-hour revelation. "If there's a chance, however slim," he said, his gaze meeting mine, heavy with unspoken understanding, "we have to take it. Heavenwood is counting on it." The discovery of Dr. Hayes's journals, the understanding of the lamento's origin, the significance of the locket, and the outline of the harmonization procedure, it was a desperate, improbable lifeline thrown to us in the heart of the storm. The old system of rules and rituals had crumbled, but from its ashes, a new, far more dangerous, and far more personal path had emerged. The strategic turning point wasn't about finding a stronger ward or a more potent incantation. It was about understanding that the only way to confront a sorrow of this magnitude was not with force, but with a terrifying, radical empathy. And I, Leo Maxwell, the grieving brother, the accidental gatekeeper, was to be its instrument. The locket pulsed, a silent, urgent call to a destiny I could never have imagined. A fragile, desperate kind of energy now filled Miss Albright's cramped office, a stark contrast to the crushing despair that still emanated from the main pharmacy. The quietude logs lay open on the desk, their spidery script illuminated by the locket's unwavering silvery glow and the unsteady beam of Silas's flashlight. We worked with a focused intensity born of sheer necessity, the proximity of the lamento inconsolable a constant, chilling reminder of the stakes. Miss Albright, drawing on some hidden reserve of strength, directed Silas to the pharmacy's deepest, most ancient storage shelves, her memory, jogged by Dr. Hayes's notes, unearthing the locations of long-forgotten botanical ingredients. Black cohosh root for grounding, mugwort for psychic clarity, and a particularly rare, almost black, night-blooming cereus, said to only open its petals under the influence of profound sorrow. While Silas gathered the components, his movements now imbued with a grim purpose, I studied the ritual Dr. Hayes had outlined. It was less a spell and more of guided meditation, a dangerous descent into the lamento's core. It required the empathic catalyst, me, to create a circle of shared sorrow, using the locket as a focal point to draw in the lamento's energy, not to repel it, but to find its original, uncorrupted source. The herbs Silas would prepare into a potent, inhaled incense, designed to shield my psyche from complete annihilation, while simultaneously heightening my empathic senses. Miss Albright's role was to maintain a perimeter of stability, using passages from the quietude logs themselves, specific resonant phrases Dr. Hayes had identified, to prevent the lamento's influence from spreading beyond the immediate ritual space. The plan was terrifying in its simplicity and its audacity. We were not attempting to banish the lamento. We were attempting to acknowledge it, to offer it a form of release it had been denied for over a century. Evelyn believed, Ms. Albright murmured, tracing a passage in the journal with a trembling finger, that great unresolved echoes like this are stuck, trapped in a loop of their own trauma. They don't seek to cause harm, not intentionally. They seek an ending, a witness to their pain. Her words resonated with a truth that chilled me, even as it offered a sliver of understanding. The lamento wasn't evil, not in the way I understood the word. It was an agony so immense it had taken on a monstrous life of its own. Silas returned, his arms laden with dusty jars and dried bundles of herbs, their scents mingling in the close air, earthy, pungent, faintly sweet. He began to prepare the incense with practiced hands, crushing and mixing the components in an old stone mortar and pestle he produced from a forgotten cabinet, his brow furrowed in concentration. There was a quiet dignity to his movements, the ancient craft of the apothecary reawakening within him. "This will be potent," he said, his voice low. "It will open doors in your mind, Leo, doors you might not be prepared for. You must hold on to yourself, hold on to Sarah's memory, not as a source of your own pain, but as an anchor to your humanity." His advice was a lifeline in the churning sea of my fear. As the Cometa Silencioso, the celestial event Ms. Albright had dreaded, began its closest approach, a fact we knew not by seeing it, but by the way the lamento's power surged, making the very floorboards tremble and the air crackle with an almost visible static. We knew our time was running out. The lamento's whispers were no longer just murmurs. They were becoming a chorus of childlike sobs, of terrified screams. The final moments of the Havenwood orphanage fire replaying themselves in an endless, agonizing loop. The psychic pressure was immense, threatening to crush us before we even began. We had to move, now, into the heart of the storm. Ms. Albright led the way, holding aloft one of Dr. Hayes's journals like a shield. Silas followed, carrying the smoking censer, its acrid, strangely calming smoke already beginning to fill the darkened aisles. I came last, the locket clutched so tightly in my hand that its edges bit into my palm. As we stepped out of the relative sanctuary of the office and into the main pharmacy, the full force of the lamento hit us. It was a maelstrom of despair, a vortex of black, swirling energy that had now coalesced into a towering, vaguely humanoid shape in the center of the store, where the silent dispensing counter once stood. Its form was indistinct, constantly shifting, yet the impression of countless small, reaching hands, of wide, terrified eyes within its shadowy mass, was unmistakable. "Now, Ms. Albright," Silas rasped, his voice strained. She took a deep breath and began to read from the journal, her voice, though trembling, carrying a surprising authority, reciting Dr. Hayes's words of grounding and demarcation. The lamento paused, its chaotic energy momentarily disrupted by the unexpected intrusion of structured intent. This was our chance. Silas placed the sensor on the floor in what Dr. Hayes's notes designated the epicenter of the sorrow, directly before the lamento. He then began to sprinkle a circle of salt and crushed protective herbs around me, a fragile, symbolic barrier. "Breathe deep, Leo," he urged, "and remember who you are." My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the lamento's overwhelming symphony of pain. This was it, the point of no return. I looked at the monstrous, sorrowful entity before me, an entity born of the unimaginable suffering of children. My own grief for Sarah, so long a source of my own torment, now felt different. It was still there, a raw, aching wound, but it was no longer just mine. It was a bridge. The moment I stepped fully into the salt circle, the world outside vanished. The dim, flickering lights of Serenity Scripps, the anxious faces of Silas and Miss Albright, even the acrid scent of the protective incense, all receded, replaced by an overwhelming internal landscape of pure, unadulterated sorrow. It was as if I had plunged into a black, icy ocean, the lamento inconsolave's despair, a crushing pressure from all sides. The whispers were no longer external, they were inside my head, a cacophony of children's voices, crying out in fear, in pain, calling for mothers who would never come, their final, terrified moments replaying with unbearable, visceral clarity. I saw flames, felt the searing heat, tasted the choking ash. Their terror became my terror, their loss my loss. The locket in my hand was a burning coal, its heat a singular point of focus in the swirling chaos of a century's accumulated grief. I clutched it, a lifeline to my own identity, as the lamento probed, tested, tried to absorb me into its vast, undifferentiated misery. It wasn't malicious, not in a way I could define. It was an inevitability, a black hole of sorrow, drawing everything into its desolate core. Images of Sarah flooded my mind, no longer gentle memories, but a fresh, agonizing reliving of her illness, her decline, her final rasping breaths. The lamento was feeding on my grief, using it as a conduit to deepen its hold, to merge my individual pain with its collective agony. I felt myself slipping, my sense of self fraying, the desire to surrender, to simply cease, becoming almost irresistible. No, the thought, faint at first, then stronger, rose from some deep, resilient core within me. This wasn't just about my pain, it was about theirs, the children, the ones who had never had a chance. Sarah had known love, had known moments of joy, however brief. These echoes had known only a terrifying, fiery end. Silas's words echoed in my mind. Hold on to Sarah's memory, not as a source of your own pain, but as an anchor to your humanity. I focused on the locket, on the faint, sweet scent of lemon verbena I still associated with it, a scent that now mingled with the phantom smell of smoke and burning wood. I forced myself to see beyond my own suffering, to reach for the original, pure note of their collective trauma, buried beneath layers of distorted, amplified despair. "I hear you," I whispered, my voice a ragged tear in the psychic maelstrom. The words felt inadequate, yet they were all I had. I hear your fear. I see your pain. I wasn't speaking to the monstrous, towering form of the lamento, but to the countless terrified child souls trapped within it. I pictured them not as a seething mass of darkness, but as individuals, small hands reaching out, small faces streaked with soot and tears. I let my own sorrow for Sarah flow outwards, not as a surrender, but as an offering, a bridge of shared experience. I know what it is to lose, I projected, not with words, but with the raw, unfiltered emotion of my own heart. I know what it is to be afraid. You are not alone. The lamento recoiled, a shockwave of confusion and disbelief rippling through its dark form. It had expected resistance, or surrender. It had not expected acknowledgement, empathy. The chorus of terrified whispers faltered, replaced by a single, sustained note of profound, questioning grief. The locket pulsed, its silvery light expanding, pushing back the oppressive darkness, creating a small, fragile sanctuary of clarity within the storm. I could feel Miss Albright's voice, a distant, steady drone, reciting Dr. Hayes's passages of harmonization, a thread of sanity in the madness. Silas's incense swirled around me, its potent aroma grounding me, preventing my consciousness from completely fragmenting. I focused on the central point of the lamento, seeking the very first spark of that ancient fire, the genesis of its 100-year ache. And then I saw her, or rather, felt her. A little girl, no older than 7, clutching a rag doll, her eyes wide with a terror that transcended time. She was the nexus, the original trauma, her individual fear the seed from which this monstrous sorrow had grown. The locket, it had been hers. I extended my hand, not physically, but psychically, offering the locket, offering not a cure, not an absolution, but a simple, profound act of witnessing. I see you, I projected towards her. Your pain is real. Your loss is remembered. For a timeless moment, everything hung in the balance. The lamento's immense power churned, a vortex of conflicting energies. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the monstrous form began to shift. The darkness seemed to soften. The chorus of screams and sobs began to quiet, replaced by a low, mournful hum, a sound less of terror and more of release. The reaching hands within its shadowy mass seemed to unclench, to relax. The little girl, the core echo, stepped forward from the darkness, her spectral form clearer now, her eyes, though still filled with an ancient sadness, holding a flicker of peace. She reached out and, with a touch as light as a falling feather, accepted the locket. As her fingers closed around it, a wave of pure, unadulterated light erupted from the lamento. Not a destructive explosion, but a gentle, pervasive radiance that filled the entire pharmacy. It wasn't a banishment of sorrow, but a transmutation. The overwhelming despair was being diffused, harmonized, broken down into its constituent parts, into individual memories, individual griefs. No longer a monstrous collective entity, but a vast, sighing release. The lamento inconsolable, the great sorrow, was not being defeated, it was being understood, heard. And in that act of profound empathic connection, it was finally, after a century of tormented existence, beginning to find its quietus. The absolute had been met, not with power, but with a shared human heart. The intense light began to fade, and with it the crushing psychic pressure. I felt a profound exhaustion, a bone-deep weariness, but also a strange, hollowed-out sense of peace. The whispers were gone. The oppressive cold had lifted. As my own consciousness slowly returned to the mundane confines of Serenity Scripts, I saw Silas and Miss Albright staring, their faces awash with a mixture of terror, awe, and disbelief. The towering, shadowy form of the Lamento was gone. In its place, near the now ruined narcotics cabinet, stood only a faint, shimmering afterimage, like heat haze above a summer road, which, even as we watched, slowly, gently, faded into nothingness. The quietude, the true quietude, had returned. The silence that descended upon Serenity Scripts in the aftermath of the Lamento's dissipation was unlike any I had experienced before. It wasn't the brittle, carefully maintained quiet of the protocols, nor the oppressive, terror-filled silence of the Lamento's reign. This was a profound, almost sacred stillness, the quiet of a battlefield after the war has ended, tinged with exhaustion and a fragile, nascent peace. The air, though still cool, no longer carried the biting chill of concentrated despair. Instead, there was a faint, lingering scent of old lavender and something akin to rain on dry earth, a cleansing aroma that seemed to emanate from the very walls. The locket lay on the floor where the Lamento's core had been, no longer glowing, just a small, ordinary piece of antique silver. I swayed on my feet, the adrenaline that had sustained me through the ordeal draining away, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness that settled into every fiber of my being. Silas was at my side in an instant, his strong hand gripping my arm, steadying me. "Leo, son, are you all right?" His voice was hoarse, laced with an awe. The pharmacy was a wreck. Shelves were askew, bottles shattered, their contents forming strange alchemical pools on the linoleum. The heavy steel door of the narcotics cabinet hung grotesquely from one hinge, a testament to the Lamento's raw power. Yet, amidst the physical chaos, there was an undeniable shift in the pharmacy's atmosphere. The oppressive weight was gone. The subtle, constant thrum of unseen sorrow that had always permeated Serenity Scripts had quieted. It wasn't entirely absent, perhaps it never would be, but it was muted, like a distant echo rather than an immediate presence. The delicate balance had not just been restored, it had been fundamentally altered, recalibrated on a new, more stable foundation. In the days and weeks that followed, the transformation became more apparent, both within Serenity Scripts and within myself. The quietude shift continued, but it was different. The echoes, the lesser manifestations of sorrow, still appeared, but their presence was softer, less tormented. Their silent needs were easier to intuit, their desolation less acute. The valerian root for the toy aisle cries was needed less frequently, and when it was, the cries themselves seemed less fraught with terror, more like a child's simple, mournful sigh. The rules, those strange arcane protocols, still technically applied, but their rigid necessity seemed to have lessened. We still maintained the quiet, but it felt less like a prison and more like a sanctuary. The most profound transformation, however, was within me. The agonizing, all-consuming grief for Sarah, while not gone, had shifted. The encounter with the Lamento, the act of opening myself to that vast, ancient sorrow, had somehow contextualized my own loss. It hadn't diminished it, but it had integrated it into a larger tapestry of human suffering and resilience. The raw, jagged edges of my pain had been smoothed, replaced by a quieter, more profound understanding. I no longer felt like I was drowning in my grief. I was learning to swim alongside it. And with this shift came a new, unexpected ability, a heightened sensitivity to the emotional currents of Serenity scripts, an almost clairvoyant understanding of the Echo's needs, far beyond the intuition the old rules had demanded. Ms. Albright, too, was changed. The brittle tension that had always defined her seemed to have eased, replaced by a quiet, almost weary wisdom. She began to share more of Dr. Hayes's journals with Silas and me, not as a set of instructions, but as a source of ongoing study and understanding. The Oversight Committee did eventually arrive, not as stern judges, but as hushed, almost reverent observers, sensing the profound shift that had occurred. They made no attempts to recalibrate. Instead, they took copious notes, their official reports likely to become another layer in Serenity Script's long, strange history. It seemed the pharmacy, under our desperate, accidental stewardship, had achieved a level of stability they hadn't thought possible. Silas, for his part, seemed to have found a renewed sense of purpose. He began experimenting with Dr. Hayes's botanical formulas, not just for containment, but for genuine, albeit subtle, psychic soothing. He started referring to our work not as managing echoes, but as tending the quiet, a subtle but significant shift in perspective. The pharmacy, he declared, was no longer just a repository. It was a convalescent home for wounded memories, a place where sorrow, given time and the right kind of quiet attention, could perhaps, eventually, find its own form of peace. The lamento insolable was gone, its concentrated despair dispersed, but the land itself still remembered, and we were its new, more attuned caretakers. As for the locket, Miss Albright had it carefully cleaned and placed it in a small velvet-lined box within Dr. Hayes's journals. A relic, a reminder, a key. Its light was extinguished, its immediate purpose served, but its presence was a constant testament to the night the absolute sorrow had been met not with force, but with a shared human heart. I no longer carried the weight of an unknown future in my pocket, but I carried something far more profound within me, the knowledge that even the deepest darkness can be touched by understanding, and that true quietude is not the absence of sound, but the presence of peace. Serenity Scripts had taken much from me, but it had also given me something unexpected in return, a path through my own despair, and a purpose I was only just beginning to comprehend. 6 months have passed since the night the Lamento Inconsolable found its quietus within the walls of Serenity Scripts. Havenwood remains blissfully unaware of the psychic cataclysm it so narrowly averted, its residents continuing their lives with the same muted resignation, the same quiet struggles. Yet for those of us who walk the aisles of the pharmacy after dark, everything is different. The oppressive weight that once defined this place has lifted, replaced by a stillness that feels clean. It's the quiet of a room after a long illness has finally broken, a silence filled not with absence, but with the faint, hopeful hum of healing. The quietude shift is no longer a sentence, but a vigil. I still work the night shift, Leo Maxwell, the accidental gatekeeper, now a more willing, if weary, custodian of Havenwood's sorrowful echoes. My grief for Sarah is a part of me, a quiet ache that reminds me of the love we shared, but it no longer defines me. The raw edges have softened, not through forgetting, but through a strange, profound integration that occurred in the heart of the lamento's storm. My heightened sensitivity to the echoes remains, a constant, low-level awareness of the emotional undercurrents that flow beneath the surface of this old town. It's a gift, of sorts, though one I would never have chosen. It allows me to prescribe with a new precision, to offer not just energetic placebos, but genuine, albeit subtle, moments of psychic respite to the lingering echoes. Miss Albright has found a new, almost serene sense of purpose. She's become the unofficial archivist of Dr. Evelyn Hayes's work, meticulously cataloging the quietude logs, cross-referencing them with the pharmacy's oldest formularies, seeking to understand the deeper science, or perhaps art, behind what we do. She speaks of establishing a protocol of empathic resonance, a more humane, more effective way of tending to the echoes than the rigid, fear-based rules of the past. The Oversight Committee, impressed and a little bewildered by the transformation of Serenity Scripts, has given her a surprising degree of autonomy, recognizing perhaps that some mysteries are best left to those who have walked through their fire. Silas, bless his stoic heart, continues to be my steadfast companion in the quiet hours. He's become something of a master herbalist, his compounding lab now filled with the rich, earthy scents of rare botanicals, as he refines Dr. Hayes's formulas, creating new balsams for the bruised memory, as he calls them. He still offers his quiet wisdom, his weary sighs, but there's a new lightness in his eyes, a sense that the long, thankless vigil he has kept for so many years might finally be leading towards something more than mere containment. We are, in our own strange way, a team, bound together by the shared trauma and the improbable triumph of that terrible, transformative night. The echoes still come. The woman in the lace dressing gown, her wariness now tinged with a faint translucence, as if she is slowly, gently fading. The man in shadows, who now sometimes leaves a perfectly rendered charcoal sketch of a vibrant flower on his tray, a hint of colors rediscovered. Even the toy aisle cries, when they occur, are softer, more like a child's sleepy murmur than a shriek of terror. The valerian is often unnecessary. Sometimes just a moment of focused, empathic acknowledgement from me is enough to soothe the lingering disquiet. Serenity Scripts is no longer a dam holding back a flood of despair. It is becoming a garden where old sorrows are tended, understood, and perhaps, very slowly, encouraged to bloom into something resembling peace. I often find myself standing before the now repaired narcotics cabinet, where the Lamento made its final desperate stand. The physical damage has been mended, but the memory of its immense, sorrowful power remains, a constant reminder of the fragility of peace, of the thin veil between our mundane reality and the ocean of emotions that lies just beyond. The locket sits in its velvet box, a silent sentinel. I know, with a certainty that settles deep in my bones, that our work here is not truly over. The Lamento Inconsolable may have found its release, but Havenwood, like any town, will continue to generate new sorrows, new echoes that will, in time, seek solace within these walls. The delicate balance is not a static state, but an ongoing process, a constant act of tending. Sometimes, in the deepest quiet of the night, when the only sound is the hum of the ancient lights and the soft rustle of my own breathing, I think I can still feel a faint, residual echo of those lost children from the orphanage, not in fear, but in a kind of gratitude, a gentle, sighing presence that whispers of remembrance, of a pain finally witnessed. And I think of Sarah. I picture her not in her hospital bed, but as she was, bright, vibrant, full of laughter. My grief is no longer a weapon turned inward, but a quiet strength, a wellspring of the empathy that this strange, sorrowful pharmacy and its unseen patients so desperately require. I am Leo Maxwell. I am the keeper of the quietude. And here, in the heart of Havenwood's hushed sorrows, I have finally found a semblance of my own serenity. The shift continues.